Namaste and welcome to Pods by PEI, a policy discussion podcast series brought to you by Policy Entrepreneurs Inc. My name is Khushi Hang, and in today's episode, PEI colleague Aslesh is in conversation with economist Prajwal Joshi on unpacking de-dollarization, trends, issues, and implications. Prajwal is an economist at South Asia Watch on Trade Economics and Environment Nepal, with over 7 years of research and advisory experience in areas of trade policy, public debt management, alternative finance, and private sector development. His contributions include national-level studies and publications with the Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Industry, Commerce and Supplies, and various UN agencies. Aslesh and Prajol discuss the dominance of the US dollar and the emerging trend of de-dollarization. Prajol traces the dollar's rise to the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement and its enduring role in global trade, finance, and reserves. They discuss why countries are now seeking alternatives, noting efforts for change like China's push for yuan-based trade and BRICS efforts to build parallel systems and consider implications for small economies like Nepal. Like listening to pods? We'd love to hear your thoughts. So please comment on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen to the show. You can also follow us on Twitter at @tweet2PEI and on Facebook and Instagram at Policy Entrepreneurs Inc. for updates on the latest episodes. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
Welcome, Prajwal, to Pods by PA.
Thank you, Aslesh. Glad to be here.
Today's conversation, we would like to delve into the dominance of US dollars or USD in the world economy and the current conversations or ideas on de-dollarization. Since you recently published an article on de-dollarization, revisiting US dollar dominance, we'd like to discuss further into this and what repercussions does it have for various economies like India, China, and consequently Nepal. So before going into those aspects of de-dollarization, would you briefly explain how the US dollar came into dominance in the economy historically and then the current context of dominance of USD? And given that, what were the major events in the world economy that kind of generated this hegemony of US dollars?
Yes, thank you, Aslesh. That's a very good question to start our conversation, actually. But before answering the question, I'll just briefly introduce what do we understand by dollarization. So the US dollar since the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944 has undisputedly been the world's reserve or dominant currency, or sometimes it's also called currency of hegemony. So US dollars is the most commonly held currency by almost all of the countries worldwide, and it has a huge role in the global economy, especially in three major international transactions. First, for international trade, second, for international or cross-border payments, and the third, for countries' reserves. So before US dollars, the dominant currency was Great Britain pound sterling between 1800s to early 1900s. And at that time, it was sensible as well because Britain was the largest trading country and the center of global finance for that time. So to understand how the US dollars came to be the world's dominant currency, we need to go back to 1944 and the Bretton Woods Agreement. World War II had just ended. The global economy was in shambles. They want stability. They want their stability. And they didn't want to repeat the mistakes of 1930s, what happened immediately after the World War I. So what happened immediately after World War I was, in pursuit to recover their economy, countries started to devalue their own currency first, and they erected several trade barriers to restrict other countries' imports to their own country. So all of this led to the collapse of the financial system, which we commonly know as Great Depression. So people lose employment, people lost their income, affecting their living standards and everything. So all this led to the World War II. And the countries did not want it to repeat this same trend again. So that's why at Bretton Woods, leaders agreed on a new system where the US dollars would be pegged to gold. The price was pegged at US dollars 35 an ounce of gold. And all other currencies would be tied to the US dollars. And this made sense at that time because US was the world's largest economy, had the deepest financial markets, and was less damaged during the World War, and also had the biggest gold reserves as well. But to further their pursuit to reinforce the dollar's central role, they established two key international or multilateral institutions, we call it today. Those were International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. Both of these steps led to the US taking the role of the world's dominant currency. Since then, the entire international financial system has been built around the US dollars, which has given them a huge significant advantage that went beyond finance as well. One popular statement by President Nixon's Treasury Secretary John Connally, who has famously remarked that the US dollars is our currency, but it is your problem, because even though US dollars is a national currency, where US had their own monetary policy, US had their own fiscal policies, but the impact on the United States usually extends globally. So that is the influence they have got. To put it simply, the dollar became dominant because of the history, because of the trust towards the US economy and the scale of the US economy. And those advantages built on each other over the time.
Given that you've already mentioned US being the dominant economy in the world, we can look into international trade or the financial markets that have been established in the US. Can you provide more evidence on the current scenario on how US is dominating in terms of maybe foreign reserves, or what kind of international transactions that take place between US and the other economies, and maybe how the Federal Reserve provides US dollars in the world economy so that dominance keeps on continuing?
Yes, definitely, Aslesh. The sheer size of US economy, it's almost a quarter of global GDP and almost 1/3 of the world trade. These two factors, the sheer size of US economy, has supported the continued dominance of the USD. Second, the depth of the US financial market. So investors are confident, investors trust that they can buy and they can sell US dollars assets quickly and safely. So something which they cannot expect or could not trust for other currencies. Thirdly, yes, true. Data-wise, almost 90% of the foreign exchange trades involved US dollars, almost 90%. Though there are 192 official currencies in the world, almost 90% of the foreign currency trades involved US dollars. Almost 60% of the central bank reserves held by the countries worldwide are denominated in US dollars. Nearly half of the world trade is priced in US dollars, even when the US isn't directly involved. The dominance extends to international payments as well, with more than 40% of all SWIFT transactions conducted in US dollars. Even in the international debt market as well, the US dollar remains a key player, with 17.6% of the cross-border loans and 5.9% of international debt securities are still denominated in US dollars. So these figures highlight the US dollar's intense role in global trade, finance, and debt markets, reinforcing its continued dominance.
Okay, now we've established that USD is the dominant currency and how it has come to be. Let's go into the concept of de-dollarization. Basically, could be defined as the shrinking influence of USD or the reduction in the usage of USD in the world economy, right? So why would a country want to do this, or why would various economies in the world want to bring this structural shift to reduce the usage of USDs in their economy, or diversify in terms of various foreign currencies? They would want to diversify their portfolio, let's say.
So yes, Aslesh, you're absolutely correct. De-dollarization is about reducing reliance on the US dollars in trade, reserves, and financial transactions. But we have to keep in mind that it does not mean abandoning the dollar completely overnight. It's more of a structural shift where countries diversify into other currencies like euro, renminbi, or their own currencies, or use gold, or sometimes set of alternative payment systems as well. So theoretically, for de-dollarization, what countries have to do is countries have to shift their transactions away from US dollars. That means that they should have their reserves in some other currencies than US dollars. They should invoice their cross-border payments in some other currencies except US dollars. They should be borrowing, or they should be lending in some other currencies other than US dollars. Why the countries or the world economy wanted to de-dollarization is especially because of the dominant position it gives to the US. So US can sanction any country, just like it did to Russia. US has sanctioned almost 300 billion of Russian money. The US has been using it as a geopolitical tool, particularly in restricting trade and investment. And this has prompted some countries to seek alternatives to a US dollar-centric order, especially for those countries who are afraid of these sanctions, usually Russia, usually China, usually India. So while the US dollar's dominance has long been a pillar of international monetary system, but US has been increasingly using it as a geopolitical tool, particularly in restricting trade and investment. So that's why some countries, they wanted to move away from this US dollar-centric order. So one key reason why countries want to move away from US dollars is they want to protect their own country. They want to protect their reserves. They don't want to be vulnerable to the US sanctions, one big reason.
So let's theoretically say that the demand for US dollars decreases further and further, given that various countries start to diversify with multiple foreign currencies in their reserves. Then what happens in the world economy? This is just a theoretical question.
Yes, it's a very difficult question to answer, actually. I've been reading a lot of conversation on this topic. First, I think on all the literature, what has come up is that US currency becoming a dominant currency gave them exuberant privilege, which means the US economy has the ability to borrow cheaply because the world trust. It's a destination currency, actually. So everyone wants US dollars. So they wanted to buy US denominated treasury securities. The US economy can borrow any amount. There is no upper limit for how much they can borrow. And the interest rates would be low, would be relatively low than some other countries worldwide. So if theoretically, if the demand for US dollars decreases further and further, the US would be losing this privilege. Second, US might lose some geopolitical leverage as well. So right now, US has the single hegemony power over all the countries worldwide. They can sanction any country, they can sanction their economy, and this would have a very huge influence in other countries' economy. And they are going to lose if if demand for US dollars decreases further and further.
You've pointed out the recent events on Russia getting sanctioned by the US and their around $300 billion worth of money being frozen in accounts in various other countries. Russia has felt the brunt of US hegemony. So in recent times or in the recent decade, what evidence have you seen that, or what trends can be seen that the world economy is in some sense de-dollarizing? Are there evidences, or is it just a topic of discussion?
There are some clear trends that have been seen by the evidence, actually. One evidence is the value of foreign exchange reserves held by the countries denominated in US dollars has been gradually declining over this past 2 decades. The US dollar share in central banks' reserves was almost 71% in 2000, but which has come down to just around 58% in 2024. So that is almost 13% decline in 24 years, which is huge. That's just a 2 decade. What the central banks are replacing them with is also an interesting trend. They are replacing it with gold. They are replacing it with some alternative currencies where Chinese renminbi has come up as a very good alternative. A more notable shift has been through the rise of alternative currencies, actually, such as the Australian and Canadian dollars, which were introduced as a reserve currency just in 2012, whereas Chinese renminbi was introduced in 2016. But the share of Chinese renminbi when it was introduced in 2016 was just less than 1%, but now has reached 2.5% in 2023. So there is some trend seeing in this side as well. But despite this shift in reserve holdings, the US dollar still remains dominant because it's almost 60% of the world reserves. So there is still a lot to go ahead with, actually. On the share of foreign exchange market turnover as well, close to 90% of foreign exchange transactions involve US dollars, whereas the other major currencies are euro, just at 30%, Japanese yen at 17%, pounds at 13%. And point to note is because in each financial transaction, there are 2 currencies involved, so total would be 200%. So out of 200%, 90% involves US dollars.
We can say that China is becoming the second most dominant economy in the world. And maybe before their currency became as trusted as it is now, they also must have been using USD to make certain payments or receive payments, right? But have you seen a change in the usage of US dollar by China in their transactions with other economies, as other economies also started making payments in RMB? What trends can we see in that?
Yes, there has been. Wherever China is a second party in any foreign transactions, they prefer to have those transactions in their own local currencies. That's why they have introduced something called bilateral swap agreements with many countries so as to avoid any kind of involvement of US dollars in this process. So, for example, if we have a bilateral swap agreement with China, then we don't need US dollars in between. We will have some volume of Chinese RMB available in our bank's accounts, which we can use to make payments of our Chinese imports, actually.
You also mentioned weaponization of the USD, right? There was a certain trade sanctions on Russia. Beyond Russia, there are other countries like Cuba, Afghanistan, North Korea, and also China who have faced certain levels of sanctions. And given those sanctions, their economy have faced negative implications. But what are the other trends beyond these countries willing to de-dollarize because of these sanctions? What are other trends that can be seen that show the world is moving towards maybe a multipolar economy? Or are there specific evidences that show de-dollarization is happening at the moment?
Yes, the key trend, I think, would be the reserves of gold. So according to data, central banks all over the world, their holdings of gold in value terms have grown almost 10 times in last 2 decades. It was just 300 billion in 2000, which has now reached almost 3,000 billion by 2024. So that is 10 times increment in almost 24 years. China alone had increased their gold holdings from just 3.5 billion US dollars in 2000 to close to 200 billion now. So in proportion terms, if we look at it, was just 12.63% of the central bank reserves was gold in 2000. Now it is 18.19% in 2024, so almost 60% increment, which is a gradual shift, but still it's a far road ahead for the complete de-dollarization we are talking about. Second, the other trend that we are seeing is the rise of regional blocs, especially BRICS. Let me just briefly introduce BRICS. So BRICS is an informal group of 5 countries, initially 5 countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, but it is expanding now. It has already added 5 new countries: Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, UAE, and Indonesia. And there are more than 24 more economists interested to join BRICS as well. BRICS has already founded a dedicated institution which is named as Contingent Reserve Arrangements, with initial funding of almost US dollars 100 billion, which can play complementary role to IMF, which we discussed earlier, played a key role for dollarizing the entire economy. So the other thing that happened recently was in 2024, when they had their BRICS summit in Russia, there was a strong discussion for the creation of a single BRICS currency, which can be used for the cross-border financial transactions between the member countries. And BRICS is huge, actually. BRICS almost has 40% of the world's GDP and 45% of the world's population. But still, despite these efforts, bloc's relatively small global presence in the relevant areas means the cross-border transactions, cross-border payments, mean we won't be seeing any immediate impact of the US dollar's dominant position.
So are there any alternatives to SWIFT transactions in the global economy, or is it because it's the most favorable or most trusted one, currently we don't have any alternatives to that?
Currently, there is no pure alternative, but there has been significant development in this area as well, especially the central banks worldwide. They are working to develop central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. So it has shown a huge potential. Almost 111 countries worldwide, who represents almost 95% of the global GDP, are actively pursuing CBDCs, while few of the countries like Nigeria, Bahamas has already launched this. So Chinese CBDC, which is popularly referred as digital yuan or ECNY, which intends to replicate and potentially replace the role of cash within the Chinese economy, is fast evolving. And alongside the growing digital yuan, there has been continuous development in a technology called BRICS, which is a blockchain-based platform that directly connects jurisdictional digital currencies, means digital currencies from different countries with each other, which can potentially replace the SWIFT as well. The other development to replace SWIFT has been the bilateral currency swap agreement, which I mentioned earlier as well. So China has been actively pushing to its partner countries to sign bilateral currency swap agreement. What is bilateral currency swap agreement? It's basically a deal between central banks of two countries that allow them to exchange or swap their currencies directly. So what does this do is this creates a pool of local currencies that businesses in each country can use to make their payments of their transactions. So there is no need for US dollars as an anchor currency. So China has signed these type of agreement with almost 30 countries, and the worth or the value of all those agreements is close to $500 billion. So the system, they are gradually trying to develop the alternative to SWIFT. They are moving towards, but still there is no perfect replacement for SWIFT currently.
Given that you've mentioned gold reserves coming up as an alternative for central banks to hold reserves in, I'd like to bring in a statement by Imaru Casanova and Joe Foster at the VanEck. They argue that they're seeing some economic tremors due to de-dollarization, noting that despite its continued dominance, the dollar has been devaluing relative to gold, an unprecedented trend. It is unprecedented because it has happened during a period of relative dollar strength and the absence of any economic crisis. So they say the current gold bull market is being driven by an erosion of confidence in the dollar. What are your thoughts on this?
True. There is a very interesting phenomenon that has been seen. Usually what literature suggests is that US dollars and gold prices usually have an inverse relationship, meaning that when the price of US dollars goes up, the price of gold should go down. So there is an inverse relationship. But interestingly, in last few years, what has been seen is that US dollars are strong, but still gold prices are going up. And one of the reasons why this trend has been happening is that because central banks has been demanding more and more of gold as their reserves. So more demand means higher prices for gold as well. So this trend has shown that central banks are inclined to have more gold into their reserves than US dollars. But still, as we have already discussed on the data, is still a long way ahead. What I see is that gold is just an insurance policy for countries right now. For a short-term transition, they just want to avoid the volatility that has been created by the US dollars. So they want to have certain proportion of their reserves as gold as well, so as to protect their country, their economy from the volatility in the US dollars.
So bringing the conversation closer to us, we want to also discuss a little bit on the potential implications of de-dollarization to the Nepali economy. Nepal has most of the trade with its two neighboring countries, India and China, but receives a lot of international aid in US dollars from the World Bank and the IMF. And in that sense, what are the possible implications or impacts of de-dollarization in Nepal?
Yes, indeed. Worldwide, the US dollar still remains the dominant currency, and Nepal is not an exception. So for Nepal as well, the US dollar still matters a lot. Most of our aid, trade and remittances are denominated in US dollars. And Nepal Rashtra Bank, the central bank of Nepal, holds most of its reserves in US dollars. Just to quote data, so 75% of outstanding external debt of Nepal government is denominated in SDR and 17% in US dollars. But within the SDR as well, 44% of SDR is US dollars. So that brings Nepal's exposure to US dollars to almost 51% in the total outstanding debt of government of Nepal. So what I see is that if this trend of de-dollarization continues at a regional level as well, things could change. India has taken several initiatives to encourage their trade in Indian rupees. Few of the initiatives are India has permitted the use of Indian rupee for international trade settlements. Indian governments have been encouraging their local firms to conduct cross-border transactions in their local currencies. More foreign commercial banks are allowed to hold rupee accounts, almost from the 20 different countries. So if more of our trade can be settled in Indian rupee, it will reduce transaction cost for Nepal and makes us less vulnerable to dollar swings. So currently, less than 20% of Nepali imports from India, and all external debts from India involves US dollars. So that means that we have to convert Nepalese rupee into US dollars first and then into Indian rupees. So that will involve certain amount of transaction costs. So if we can remove this US dollars as an anchor currency, then our transaction cost will be low and will not be so much vulnerable to US dollars. Why we are being vulnerable to US dollars is that because Nepalese rupee has been depreciating every year against the US dollars. So if you see debt reports published by the Public Debt Management Office of Nepal, there has been increase in external debt every year just due to the depreciation of Nepalese rupees. And this kind of vulnerability can be reduced if de-dollarization happens. But on the other hand, for trade with rest of the world, the US dollar will still remain key. So for Nepal, it's less about replacing the dollar, but more about adopting to a world where multiple currencies matter, what you already termed multipolarization, multipolar economy. So dollar globally, whereas rupee regionally we're talking about. So on the risk side as well, so the potential risk for Nepal is that Nepal have to manage their reserves in multiple currencies. So Nepal's economy is small. We have a very small foreign exchange reserves, relatively very small foreign exchange reserves. So if we have to have this relatively small foreign exchange reserves in different currencies, then that would be a very complex task. And that means the capacity of the state level should also improve side by side.
So for smaller economies like Nepal, with less expertise on managing multiple currencies in the reserves, is it beneficial that they hold majority of amount of reserves in the USD?
Yes, exactly. Putting our reserves in multiple different currencies at one place gives us the benefit of diversification. Diversification is always better. For countries like Nepal, depending on a single economy, depending on a single currency is always risky. So in that context, diversification is always better. But putting very small amount and diversifying that money into diverse currencies is more complex. The cost of transaction is higher. The cost of maintenance is higher. The cost of capacity building is higher. So yes, in that sense, it is beneficial for countries like Nepal with very small amount of foreign exchange reserves to hold reserves in few currencies. Not single currencies is not always better. So some level of diversification is required. So maybe we are talking about 3 or 4 different currencies, but not a single currency and not a large number of currencies as well.
So the most difficult question for the last one. There have been multiple statements since the 1960s. Robert Triffin discussing the end of dollar hegemony, and then Charles Kinderberger in 1976 also discussing the end of dollar dominance. And recently, as I mentioned, when the euro first came into existence, then also there was a discussion on the hegemony of dollar to end, but we still continue to see that dollar is still the dominant currency in the world, even though recent trends do show some decline in the power of dollar in the world economy. I'd like to quote Robert Wade from the London School of Economics, who says, "Dollar hegemony will surely end, but not in the foreseeable future. Most of the world has no prospect of an alternative to the international dollar to be used at a scale in the next 2 decades or so." So, in your opinion, in the foreseeable future, next few decades, do you see the dominance of dollar dwindling or continuing or becoming stronger? This is a difficult question to forecast, but just your opinion on that.
Yes, my take is de-dollarization is not going to happen anytime soon. Not in next few decades, at least not in few decades. So it's going to take more than 4 or 5 decades. So if we remember the hegemony of pound sterling, it existed for almost more than a century. So from 1800 to early 1900s. So it's going to take a few decades for replacing dollar with something else. But alternatives are slowly evolving. Alternatives like euro, renminbi, gold, digital currencies of today, they are evolving, but they have very big limitations as well. So initially, when euro was introduced in 2000, it was considered to be a very strong contender to replace US dollars. And that is when the de-dollarization, the topic of de-dollarization was evolving during that time period as well. But if you see, euro is still a strong contender. 20% of foreign exchange reserves is held in euro, but it is distantly far from US dollars. It is second position, but it is distantly far from the US dollars. And its major limitations is the structure, how European Union is structured. European Union is a currency union, which means that every countries within the European Union have their independent central banks, have their independent monetary policies, have their independent mandates. So if we have euro as a dominant currencies, then that means that any country within the European Union has any problem, that means that become a global problem for everyone. So euro has that structural problem, which is its biggest limitation to replace US dollars as a dominant currencies. Another best alternative that has evolved in recent times is Chinese renminbi, which is evolving, and it is because of the Chinese economy. It's the second largest economy. Its economy is growing every year, almost for last few decades. It had a double-digit growth rate. So Chinese economy is growing. China is showing potential. Chinese economy is showing potential. And they have been pushing the use of Chinese renminbi in the cross-border transactions, pushing every trade settlements in their own currencies. We are seeing a lot of their trade settlements with Russia and other Asian countries happening in their local currencies. China has also renminbi clearing banks. They have several bilateral swap agreements with several countries, which we have already discussed. They have also introduced Chinese cross-border interbank payment systems, which was supposed to replace SWIFT. And so they have been taking several initiatives to make them the biggest contender to replace US dollars. But the China's capital control and lack of trust of their institutions are their biggest limitation to replace US dollars as a dominant currency in near future. The other alternative that have evolved in recent times is the BRICS. They have been talking about a regional currency where they would be using that regional currency to settle cross-border transaction between their member countries. That has been evolving as well. Recently, gold and central bank digital currencies have also been evolving. So I agree with the quote by Robert Wade, who says that dollar hegemony will end one day, but not in the foreseeable future. I completely agree with his statement. In the next few decades, we'll probably see a gradual shift to a multipolar shift. So I don't see US gaining more and more dominance again. Its dominance is going to reduce every year for next few decades, but any other currencies, any other alternative would not immediately replace US dollars from its dominant position. But its size, its share will definitely go down. So I would just wanted to conclude by saying that the dollar isn't dying, but it is strongly being challenged.
All right. Okay. That's a interesting statement to end the conversation with. Thank you, Prajwal, for this very insightful conversation.
Thank you, Aslesh.
Thanks for listening to Pods by PEI. I hope you enjoyed Aslesh's conversation with Prajwal on unpacking de-dollarization, trends, issues, and implications. Today's episode was produced by Nijan Rai with support from me, Khushi Hang. This episode was recorded at the PEI studio, and our theme music is courtesy of Rohit Shakya from Zindabad. If you liked today's episode, please subscribe to our podcast. Also, please do us a favor by sharing us on social media and leaving a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen to the show. For PEI's video-related content, please search Policy Entrepreneurs on YouTube to catch the latest from us on Nepal's policy and politics. Please follow us on Twitter at tweet2PEI. That's TWEET followed by the number 2 and PEI, and on Facebook at Policy Entrepreneurs Inc. You can also visit pei.center to learn more about us. Thanks once again from me, Kushi. We will see you soon in our next episode.